Well, thank you for being here, Kyle. I'm so thrilled. If you don't mind, I would love for you to tell the audience a little bit more about you. And so maybe about your background. I know you think you used to be a Badger, right? You came to Wisconsin, but please tell us the story of how you started Clearcover.
Yeah, for sure. So let me double check. You all can hear me okay before I jump into like a long monologue about my background?
Yes, and I will let you know if that changes. But yes, we can.
All right. Fantastic. Um, so I'm super happy to be here. I went to this conference many times. I grew up in the Madison entrepreneurial community. So I was born in Wisconsin, born in Milwaukee. Did my undergrad at UW Madison and UW Oshkosh. Did my grad degrees at UW Madison. So I'm Wisconsin born and bred. Very very happy to be back talking to all of you. Um, so the sort of the short origin story. My background in Clearcover is effectively I was I'll, I'll try to not make this too long. I was a political science major in undergrad because I was a football player, and those were the classes that were easiest to skip. Don't tell my mom. So I got done with undergrad and said, okay, what am I going to do with this? And decided to go to law school because that was a way not to get a real job, but everybody seemed proud of me anyways. And so I went to law school, not knowing at all what I was getting into. Got there and said, "Oof, I don't know about this." Ended up getting an MBA while I was in law school, and throughout the program spent most of my time not going to class and going out into the community through various clinical programs and on my own working with startups and entrepreneurs because I just was really passionate about venture capital and entrepreneurship and the startup space overall. And so it turns out, in grad school in particular, as long as you show up and take the test and do okay, you'll pass and you pay your bills on time, they'll give you your sheet of paper. So I didn't go to class very much, spent a lot of time in the community working with as many startups as I could. Um, got a job as an attorney briefly at a firm in town called Alpha Tech Counsel that works exclusively with startup companies. So I don't know if Matt's in the audience or not, but he'll tell you, he will confirm I was a crappy attorney. Fortunately, I wasn't an attorney very long, and after about a year of that, was very fortunate to meet Peter Gunder, who at the time was the EVP of Strategy and Chief Investment Officer at American Family. And Peter is a visionary, very prescient person, and he had this idea that American Family was going to really dive headlong into the startup ecosystem and the entrepreneurial space. And I think if you look at that company over the past couple of years, you've seen that really play out. But Peter said, "Why don't you come and help us figure this thing out, and maybe help us figure out how we get into venture capital?" So I joined AmFam really at the end of 2012 and partnered with Dan Reed, who's the managing director of American Family Ventures, to help build out their venture team. And we can get into some of the Clearcover origin story, but it was really through that experience and like working in the sort of venture and insurance ecosystem with entrepreneurs and startups that the original ideas for Clearcover were born.
That's so fascinating. Yeah, I know the American Family, they have a presence here in Madison, right? And in kind of this insurance space here. So that's unique, and I think, it's kind of a unique part of that Wisconsin entrepreneur story too. So what is, if you don't, so diving into Clearcover a little bit, I'd love to hear the story, the gory details, or what was, yeah, how'd it come out?
So this is another story that gets told much better over like a spotted cow or your choice of whiskey. So I'll give you the short and abbreviated version this time around. But essentially, when we started American Family Ventures at the end of 2012, there was not a lot of interest in the insurtech ecosystem. So the entrepreneurial world and venture capitalists had not yet turned their attention to insurance as this next big area where they wanted to spend their money, and neither had we. We were spending most of our time looking at SaaS companies, looking at device companies, in the Internet of Things space, really, not doing much in insurance specifically, doing things that were connected to the future of insurance, but in some adjacent market. And then right around 2014, 2015 is when the market really turned its attention towards insurance as this next big area of fintech where they were going to put a bunch of investment dollars, which on one hand was great for us because we suddenly became very popular. People from all over, big firms, names you would recognize, were sort of reaching out saying, "Hey, what do you think? What's your take on this insurtech space?" Which is great, except when you don't know what you're talking about, which I did not because I had spent the first couple of years of my time there pretty much ignoring the insurance space. So so I spent 2 years or so really sort of digging in, and like end of 2014, early 2015, really digging in and learning the space and like trying to come up to speed in insurtech as much as possible. And fortunately, we were surrounded by two things that made that very easy. One was the resources at American Family and the depth of knowledge and experience that came from operating within an insurance company. And the second was all of these smart entrepreneurs in this space who suddenly had a reason to talk to us. So we are just kind of sitting in this crossfire of like really smart people who knew the space and like conventional wisdom quite well, and all of these people who were trying to challenge conventional wisdom. And sitting in the middle of that crossfire ideas was amazing. Just an absolute breeding ground for thinking about what works and what doesn't, and what are you going to build and not build. And so we were coming up with a handful of investment theses where we were going to spend our time and money. One of which was, how would someone build the next giant insurance company, the next Geico, Progressive, State Farm, et cetera? And at the time, there were only a handful of people trying. There were probably 2, 3, 4 companies even giving it a shot. And so we said, we looked at the market. We didn't have a ton of data to go from. We're kind of building our thesis from scratch, and we came up with this idea, which is effectively, the short thesis behind Clearcover was almost everyone out there was trying to figure out what the silver bullet solution was to building a next gen insurance company. So what's the one special thing you could do, whether it's pricing per mile or pricing based on how you drive, or giving you devices to help measure, like protect your home from water damage, et cetera. We said all of that is useful and interesting, but this is not a silver bullet game. Insurance is a bit of a lead bullet game. You have to do many, many things right over the span of time in order to win customers, because the product itself is relatively commoditized. It's about small wins, not one big win, which is a little different in the startup space. And the way that you build a platform to generate those small wins repeatedly and sustainably over time was cost structure. You use technology to improve your cost structure. Those two things would allow you to to provide more value to consumers than your competitors over the span of time. So we just had this idea that cost structure was the key to building this next gen insurance company. We looked out into that market. We did not see many people trying to do it. And so, my co-founder, Derek Brigham, who's also in Madison, and I left American Family at the end of 2016 to start Clearcover with this idea. And here we are today.
Yeah. 2016 feels like a lifetime ago.
Certainly.
And so, because even to kind of continue right on that, catch us up at kind of up to the pandemic. So what was it like in those initial years, and then as the pandemic hit, what was that like as a leader?
So I'll sort of give you a quick timeline here, and coming up to 2020. So we launched the company at the end of 2016, and it was literally the American Family was kind enough to let us leave and start this company, but it was a bit like the dog that catches the car. Right? We were like, yeah, we need to leave, we need to leave, we need to leave, we need to start this company. And then suddenly one day you're out, you're gone, and you're like, oh shit, what do I do now? Like this is a real thing. So it's Derek and I in a room coming up with OKRs just for the two of us, end of 2016. We built the initial team. We launched our first product in 2018. We grew really fast. We were raising money along the way. We raised our Series B at the end of 2018. We raised our Series C at the end of 2019. So now it's the beginning of 2020. We had just closed a $50 million Series C. The bank account was full enough, although it's never really full enough. And we were ready to continue launching. At that time, we were probably operating in 5 states. We had about 125 people or so. And we were ready to step on the gas. We were going to launch a bunch more states. We were going to hire a bunch more people. It was really time to grow. And we were at the time growing our call center, or had plans to grow our call center pretty substantially. And we were looking for a location to open an office, to open a claims and service call center. And we were looking at a bunch of cities in the US. So I was traveling around. It was like end of February-ish, early March. I'm traveling around, and you see that, stuff was happening on the news, but to be entirely candid, like I was kind of watching news saying like, news cycle's super fast. I'm sure this will blow over in like 3 weeks. Like there's always something people are worried about. And the first week of March, I was in Detroit, where we ended up opening up a second location and looking at office spaces, meeting people in Detroit. And I flew back on a Wednesday. And I remember that day I was flying back, our head of people called me and she said, "Hey, I really think you should quarantine when you get home. You don't come back to the office." And I was like, What the hell is quarantining? Like, what are you talking about?" She said, "I just think you should stay home." And I was like, Whatever, like, this is nuts, but sure." And, uh, and so I didn't go to the office that Thursday. Thursday, we were slacking back and forth, and she said, "I think we should keep everybody home on Friday as a test of being remote, just in case we're forced to be remote for a little while." We said, "Great." So we kept the whole company remote on Friday. We said, "Everybody work from home on Friday. We just want to test like VPN and all the different systems, and like it's a bit of a trial run." So the whole company worked remote on that Friday, and then we never came back because over that weekend, the entire tide turned, and everything shut down. So it was like a very much like, I think we did not, maybe to, my lack of credit, like did not really anticipate how quickly it was going to move. And we went from basically like things are fine to maybe you should quarantine for a day, but I don't even know what the hell that means, to just kidding, nobody come back to the office until we tell you to. And that was that, second week of March of 2020.
Yep, I remember that that week. That's really interesting, and it is. It's so funny that it was like a just in case, just in case, and then and I
That was the end of it.
remember, yeah, I remember some of those initial days being kind of a scramble, at least for me personally, and that's kind of what it felt like. But as you guys did, you started to say, all right, this is the new normal. This is where we're going to be, however long you projected out. Because like me, too, that guy kept moving further back. I was like, okay, now it's like 2 months, then I was like, okay, 6 months. But what was maybe the first thing that, like lessons you guys started to learn, or things you started to approach differently?
Yeah, so now it's March. We're fully remote. I think one is, we can't take all the credit. As a technology company, we were relatively well positioned to make the transition to full remote. And at the time, we were about 30% remote already. So it wasn't like a full cut over. Like we work with, for example, no offense if many's in the audience, but like we work with reinsurers who are older, more established companies, and they literally had to put their employees on first and second shift because their VPN couldn't handle the traffic coming through it. So literally, people couldn't use all their computers at the same time. So like we were fortunate in that like infrastructure was pretty good, and like we were a tech company to start with. So that was helpful. Um, I think the first big lesson we learned is the day we went fully remote as an organization is really the day like interpersonal serendipity died at our company. It is really hard to accidentally interact with people in a fully remote world, right? You are either slacking somebody or you need to schedule time with somebody. So like we learned this lesson of intentionality, that team building, culture building, communication, collaboration require a lot more intentionality in this world than they did in the past, when like you kind of swing by somebody's desk or you'd run into somebody in the hallway and have that discussion you were meaning to have. Like all of that kind of disappeared. So we one is, I think, we really learned like the power of intentionality and how much work and planning had to go into making sure that communication happened properly, planning happened properly, people felt like they were becoming part of the organization. um, and then two is, we had to really start focusing on um, like little things you could ignore when you were in person, right? So like, for example, we we sent a program up where we sent snack boxes to all of our employees once a month because we were stocking the office with snacks, and like we weren't doing that anymore. And it was just like a way to help people feel connected to this. So it's like really leaning into like, what are all the little things that used to happen that made you feel part of this company when we were all together, that we can still try to make happen while we're apart. And there are more. We can dig deeper into any one of these examples, but I think that the big things for me, the big takeaways that we had to learn immediately were like this idea of intentionality and like being intentional about culture building and team building in a remote world, and then double clicking on some of the little things that were, you just might forget in that happen in the office, but you really have to focus on in this new world.
I think that's really interesting. I'm especially interested in it because intentionality. I know that's something that I personally recognize too. I mean, I was all of a sudden building relationships with, in my own career, it was just very different. And it took a lot of time to kind of say, okay, well, what does that mean? How do I actually do that now? Now that it is a bunch of Zoom calls, I'd be curious, as you are, being more intentional about those things. What does that look like, maybe operationally or kind of on a day to day?
So, so there's a couple ways, and there's let me give you some good examples and some bad examples because there are experiments we've run that have failed too. So, we added north of 200 people since the pandemic started. So since that March where we all went away, and like building a culture is hard enough when you're in person. It is a bit of a different challenge when you are fully remote and you didn't intend to be fully remote. So like some of this you're building on the fly. So here's an example. I do 10-minute nice to meet you, tell me your story calls with every person that we hire. I block office hours once a week and I just do 10 minutes like, hey, who are you? Because I don't get to interview everyone anymore. And if I don't interview somebody and they don't work directly for me, it's unlikely I'm going to meet them. Right. Because again, like there are not these moments where like I'm walking to get a coffee in the kitchen and I see someone I don't recognize and I say, oh, nice to meet you. Like, what do you do here? Like, and this is like not meant to be pretentious in the least, but it's as the CEO, people tend to know who you are, but you don't get to know who they are. And that, again, like there's no serendipity. I do not accidentally meet anybody. I have to take an action to meet people now. And so I do these 10-minute office hours meetings with every single employee that we hire just to say, like, tell me about yourself. Like, I'm not going to get a chance to meet you other than this. Like, I just want to, why did you come to work here? What's been good about your onboarding process? Tell me about your family, what you're interested in. And it's great. You get to, hear people's stories. You get to connect with people in ways you otherwise wouldn't. So that's been like being intentional, positive example. So negative example, we were very big on, we had a bunch of like culture building ceremonies from the very beginning, and one of which was this ceremony we called Friday Wins. And Friday Wins is essentially an all hands meeting where the company would get together and share what they were most proud of achieving in the week prior. And when you're really small and like 20 people, it's just like 20 people in a room, and you're like, hey, like shout out to Gabe, like he had this amazing, he like had this idea this week, he executed on it, it was great, and like we had this big win, we signed up this partner. When you got to like 150 people, it was a little harder. There was like, you needed more structure, but we had like 150 people in a room, 4 p.m. on a Friday, you have a drink in hand, like you're clapping, like the energy is, it's like it really is a great culture building a moment because you're next to somebody you might not know, you get to meet them. Now you're remote. I have 250 people or 300 people on a Zoom call listening to one person share their wins for the past 2 weeks, and the meeting turned to absolute shit. It completely fell off the map. Yeah. And so we have to fix it, right? Like we held on to this ceremony that we felt was so critical to our culture, and we found out in the remote world it just didn't work the way that it should, and we had to rethink our approach. So it's just like this iterative process of saying, look, you have to be intentional, and sometimes that intention only works in your favor, and sometimes you just biff it. Like you gotta fix it. But in any case, it doesn't change the fact that you have to be thoughtful about, look, how do I get people together at the right place in the right cadence to ensure that they feel connected to the mission and to each other. Otherwise you're just a person staring at a screen full of faces you have never met and have no connection to, which is not a good way to build a workplace.
Yeah, I think we may all have some stories of those meetings that, you sat in them and 20 minutes in, you were like, you're like, let's not do this again. With different groups of people, in very different settings, that transition was tough. Yeah, I know. So, and for everybody in the audience, we're going to open up in probably about 6 or 7 minutes here to some questions. If you guys want to start thinking about those and put them in the room chat. The last thing is really curious to hear from you, Kyle. As you've grown, right? Because you touched on, you've added over 200 people. That's a lot. I'm sure you've had a lot of challenges, but I'm curious to hear maybe what do you think was different about the way you did that? And what might, if you were saying, hey, this is what we projected going in, and this is how we were going to hit the ground, what are you like, no, we're not going to do it that way anymore. We've, or however you interpret that, but kind of getting at what's changed.
Yeah, well, I think the number one thing that's changed is we have opened ourselves up more to the idea of like people working for the business that intend to remain remote indefinitely. So we were about, like I said, we're about 30% fully remote, like people who worked not in Chicago and didn't ever intend to work in Chicago, and that's probably up to like 45% or so now. So you've certainly seen like a move towards us being willing to hire in places that we would never expect them to come to Chicago, other than extenuating circumstances. Um, and then, we've also, I think, we've changed a little bit in terms of what. So, for example, we reorganized the company in the middle or so of this year, um, which we thought was going to promote better sort of cross-functional communication and collaboration, because again, the work environment is a little different than it used to be. So for example, we sort of push, it's not perfect by any means, but taking some lessons from Amazon, we push the company more towards this idea of two pizza teams. So smaller, more autonomous organizations focused on like specific and discrete goals, because a two pizza team is not only is it better generally, but it's also much easier to manage in a world where you can only talk to people on Zoom, right? Like you have 40 people on an all hands for a functional area. It turns into one of those wins meetings pretty quickly, right? So part of it for us was like we sort of onboarding process change, recruitment process change. We literally reorganized the company in in response to like making sure the teams work together really well. And maybe that's not entirely because of the pandemic, but it certainly that accelerated it. Changed how we thought about marketing. There's not really one part of the company I would say that it hadn't touched or hasn't touched in terms of how we think about building. But more, it's again, more than anything, it comes back to this idea of like, how do you build well, so taking a step back, I don't want to get too long-winded, but there I have a framework I use, which I'm sure I stole from somebody because I haven't had an original thought in many, many years. But I don't know who I stole it from. So if it's you and you're on the line, I'm sorry. But it's my I call it my organizational hierarchy of needs, and it's derived from Maslow's hierarchy. So imagine a pyramid, right? And at the base of these are the things that necessary preconditions to run a successful company, and they stack on top of each other. It means you have to have the base layer before you move on to the next layer. And so the organizational hierarchy of needs at the base layer is incentives, right? So you have to know, what does it mean to win and what is my reward for winning? That's like a basic human need within an organization, is like, how do I fulfill my own needs as a human from working here? Above that is team and organizational design. So how do we set goals, build teams, like design the organization around what it means to win, what our North Star is, and so that you can get those incentives that you care about. Above that is communication mechanisms. So communication mechanisms is essentially like literally, what are the systems and processes that we use to communicate? Do we write? Do we use PowerPoint? Do we have in-person meetings? Are we more async versus in-person? So you have to on top of your team structure, then you then have to design communication processes that are efficient and effective. On top of that is communication practices. And a practice is different than a mechanism in that a practice is like the way you do it. So communication practices like, are you candid? Do you pull some people to the side and give them immediate feedback versus hold it to yourself? Are you an asshole? Right? Like I can have a great process for enabling communication, but if you're a jerk, you're going to break my process. So now practices sits above mechanisms. And then above that is refinement, continuous improvement, right? And along the side of the pyramid is culture and people. Do you have people who share a common set of values that are connected to each of those layers of the pyramid? And so going back to your question, um, incentives didn't change much, right? Like we all knew what we were aiming for and what the prize for winning was, but just about everything above that pyramid changed, right? We had to think about team, we had to think about communication mechanisms, we had to think about practices, and we had to think about people and culture. So like you can imagine, like that's pretty much the whole company that we had to think about what might change in response to what's going on out there.
That's something. No, I like that. I was like taking notes, like fully aware, because we are recording you and I up here, so people will be able to look back later if they want to revisit, because that's I like the way you structured that. I think that's interesting, and I can see how it's like the wave of change crashes, and there's a level that remains similar, but that makes a ton of sense. I know I do want to open up the room to some questions quick and see what people are thinking. And I know I've had a lot of questions that I even myself have kept to myself. But so I want to ask one from Ross, the Ross just phrase. So Ross says, Kyle, how have you worked with existing employees that missed the good old days? When headcount was smaller, less organizational processes were necessary. How do you work with that employee?
It's really hard. This is a very good question, Ross. Some people adapt to the new organization that they work in, and some people leave. And both of those things are okay. But I think you have to acknowledge that the good old days will go away. Like I also miss the days when it's like 20 people in a room and like you knew what everybody was doing. Like there was some real fun times and there's some real benefits to doing that. But we didn't build the kind of company that can get as big as we would like to with just 20 people. So, it's I think more than anything, Ross, it's about not ignoring that this is real and having direct and candid conversations with folks and saying like, is this still the company you want to work at? And like the folks who joined when it was 20, do they still want to be at the company when it's 300, 400 people? Is this still the kind of place you would like to be at? And a sort of tacit acknowledgement that, and again, this isn't maybe the most gentle way to put it, but it is quite rare for an individual to be able to scale their capabilities as rapidly as the company grows. So more often than not, the company's growth will outstrip the individual's ability to grow with it. And it doesn't mean that that individual is less important, but they shouldn't expect to like continually raise their title and like grow at the same pace as the organization. They might find that like their sphere of influence shrinks, or that their sort of pocket of the business that they get to impact is smaller than it used to be, but still critically important to success. But it's like having that conversation of like, look, are you going to be able to scale with the company or not? And if not, that's okay. But it means one of two things. You have to be okay with what your new role is and embrace that and commit to it, or not. And you go do something else and we'll help you do that too. Right. Like, I think this idea of like, being generous when severance when required is an important part of building an org, is not letting people sort of hang on to a place it used to be when it's not that place. It's not going to be that place anymore. But it's hard. These are we've had a couple of these, and these are difficult conversations, and but they're the kind of conversations you have to have if you're gonna try and grow a company quickly.
Yeah. And Ross, if you had a follow up with that, feel free to put it in the chat, because that is a really good question, and these times are changing. Certainly. So it sounds very difficult. Does anybody else have something they were curious to hear about from Kyle? Something maybe about what we were talking about, or on the contrary, something we had not covered at all? I'll give you guys a quick second in case you are typing things up. I know, as I said, I had several that kind of came up as I was like, even just kind of listening to that. Oh, yeah. So one of them, and this one's pretty it's personal to me. So, I do a lot of getting my message out there, promoting this event, if people engaged with my promotions, marketing wise, right? Kind of like finding the message to be unique, and communicate with, with your audience, with be really just, to be a brand in this digital kind of space. Do you guys have anything you've been doing, kind of around that, or what's been your approach there?
Yeah, that's thank you for asking. So the team works really hard on this. The one that's worth noting, because it's kind of recent, is we rolled out a new campaign recently. We called our Inspired Underdogs campaign. And so taking a step back, a little over a month ago, I guess it was probably a month and a half ago or so now, they essentially changed the rules so that college athletes can now get paid for their name, image, and likeness. And it was sort of a pretty rapid change in the market. And you know, it depends on if you're an SEC fan or a Big 12 fan, I suppose, how much you might like it. But regardless, it happened, and so we wanted to respond to it. Like, it was a pretty major shift in like the advertising and marketing world in terms of sports. And as you all, I'm sure, are well aware, insurers love advertising at sporting events. So we felt like it was an opportunity to be creative and move quickly. Our team really in like 2 weeks put together our program, which is incredible. They work with a great partner called Open Doors, which is like sort of a virtual agency for these college athletes. Like, they help connect us to people and they help broker the agreements. And what we ended up building was a program where we offer $10,000 sponsorships to folks we call inspired underdogs. And these are folks who are like the unheralded and maybe unrecognized athlete on the team, who have these really amazing inspirational stories of perseverance and grit, and who have fought to get to where they were. Much like we see ourselves, sort of the underdog who's got to fight and scrap and, like, has to face adversity on their way to success. So, for example, our first inspired underdog athlete is a gentleman named Talon Litzy, who's a defensive back for the University of Illinois. And Talon has this incredible story. You can see the whole video online, but he drove up from Georgia to Illinois to walk on the team, and slept in his car during tryouts because he did not have a place to live. Made the team as a walk on, earned a scholarship this year, ran a football camp for about 150 kids for free. Like, truly inspiring story of somebody who sort of risked it all and has had an incredible amount of success. We have a badger on our inspired underdogs list. So the list is growing, but that was like a rapid shift in market conditions, which allowed us to do something relative creative, and I think something we can all be proud of in terms of the impact it's had on these athletes too.
That's cool. Yeah, I remember all the times when I was like, they'll change that rule someday, and they did. We have some really cool questions from the audience, and I know because we are gonna, in probably about 5 or 10 minutes, everybody will end up breaking, and we'll get some takeaways from Kyle. But I want to cover the questions we have in the chat because they're good. So a question from Holly. It's about a remote focus. How do you hold space for creativity and innovation, like dedicated work time and boundaries within that remote distribution?
So we leave a lot of this up to the employees. So there's a lot of things we do around mental health and wellness. This has been a particularly hard time for people for a lot of reasons. So, for example, we hold monthly mental health workshops. We provide counseling groups and one-on-ones with people who can help with that. We have like a weekly yoga class that we put together virtually. So, like, one is I think we try to create the right mental and health environment for people to stay focused and healthy. And I think that's helped. In terms of like boundaries, work life, because that has changed too. We leave a lot of that up to the employee, but there's a couple things that we encourage that I think are helpful. So one is we do encourage calendar auditing. So, like, looking back at your calendar on a weekly or monthly basis and thinking about where you spent your time and did you spend it in the right places, um, and so that helps. We also, during the summer, rolled out a 4-day work week. So for the month of July and August, we actually we're having a 4-day work week. People have off on Fridays, and what that essentially means for most folks is Friday is your day. Like, you decide, do you need to like rest for health purposes? Do you want to hang out with family? Do you want to catch up on something? But like, it's Friday becomes the employee's day. They do not owe that day to Clearcover. So I think that's been helpful too. So we like sort of provide tools, but we do largely leave like the day to day in terms of how you balance things to the employee. And I think, frankly, we hire people who are ambitious and smart and also thoughtful about how they manage their time. So we don't micromanage it too much. We try to provide tools and resources and let them do their thing.
Yeah, and I know as a quick kind of tangent too, and likewise, Holly, if you have a follow up to that, feel free to fire away the chat because that's a really good question. On Thursday, as a part of day 2 of the conference, we're going to have a panel really dedicated to remote work and remote culture, which is because it's there's so much to kind of unpack there. This is some really good insights. So if people are, and maybe Holly, you could even come in and ask that question again, if maybe based on what Kyle said, kind of take that. But yeah, so that's interesting. But it's Thursday. It's actually the beginning of day 2. And you can check it out on the website for the conference. The other good question that we had is from Clint. So Clint's asking, can you give an example of a change on the side of the pyramid, the people of the culture? So for example, maybe being sensitive to people's family needs during COVID.
Yeah, I mean, I think Clint, some of this is like the stuff that we talked about. So sort of building out tools for the organization in terms of mental health and wellness, and like counseling if needed, therapy resources if needed. So like I think providing all of that helps to keep people healthy. I also think in terms of people and culture, goes back to this idea of like, how do we create space for people to like connect with each other? Because part of building that sort of network of shared values is actually discovering that the people you work with share. So because like ultimately we have a set of operating principles that represent the things that we value as an organization, and we would expect that our employees value. And these are things like execute with urgency and focus, put the customer first. It's stuff that you would expect to see from an organization. But if you don't have the opportunity to like share the experience of using those values with somebody, then you just have to assume everybody hired has them, which is different. You connect with people differently that way. Like you literally need to be like in the trenches with somebody and watch them, you know, use the value that you share in order for that to be locked in as part of like that culture you have together. And so we try to create more opportunities for people to like overtly share those values and like work on things together, make sure they're connecting the values to the work that they're doing in front of each other, so that you again, like you have these like very tangible connection points where you say like, oh yeah, that person, one of our operating principles was something we call think betterer. And the reason we use think betterer is because best is probably not an area. It assumes like completion, and we wouldn't, you can always be better, but oftentimes just the first try at being better isn't enough. So betterer is the space between better and best, and that's where we aim. It's like that second version of better. And like the more often I can say, oh yeah, like Eric did this thing, and that was like this embodiment, like he lives this think betterer thing. Like he had a good idea and then he made it better, and he brought it back and undermined his own first idea to bring me this better idea, which is hard to do. Like now it's not just something that's on a piece of paper. I saw that in the people I work with. And so I think like that, Clint, on the culture and people side, it's again, it's been more about like trying to create moments where people can have those shared value experiences, because I think that's what really builds that layer along the side. There is a shared experience, not just saying it.
I like that. I think that's a good example, because yeah, be reinforcing, and the change that's present, over time, kind of the entropy of it. I think that's insightful, towards kind of how you can ride with that change and accommodate it and use the change as a tool, because it's inevitable, and also to reflect it. So that's fantastic. So I know everybody, yeah, we are coming to the end of what has been just so cool. It's been so good to be able to talk with you, Kyle. Thank you for being here with us. Before we duck off into the networking groups, and I'll kind of tell people how the rest of the day is going to go. Do you have any kind of takeaways that you think the audience could listen to, or things that you really think are messages we should hear?
We've talked a lot about a lot of it. I'll go back to intentionality, right? Like very, in this world, particularly when everybody is in front of their computers at home most of the time, it's hard for things to happen on accident. So you just have to be cognizant and intentional around building relationships and building your teams, um, and just patience. It's hard. Life is harder than it used to be, and people are dealing with a lot of stuff that you can't necessarily see. So um, taking a step back and sort of realizing every now and then that you're only the center of your own universe and everybody else has their own set of problems that they have to deal with, and making sure that you have the right amount of empathy and patience with your colleagues.
That's wonderful. I like that. Thank you so much for being here, Kyle. I'm gonna give you a round of applause.
Thanks for hosting, Benny. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. It's been super cool to hang out with you.